Hello everybody, my name is Ayush Bhargav and today I will be presenting my work on body scale self-avatars and the perception of passability through doorways in the real world and VR. As we all know, the spatial information we gather from our environment helps us understand what actions we can engage in. These actions are referred to as affordances or action capabilities. Researchers also stated that affordances are more task relevant as they expect the users to act in terms of their own capabilities. In general, affordances change based on our body as we move and grow. In 2009, Stefanucci et al. Investigated how changes to the body affect estimates and affordances. They reported that simply having participants stand with their arms out made the environment look bigger to them and affected their perception of passability. In a study comparing the passability judgments in the real world and VR, Gauss et al. In 2010 reported that there were no significant differences between the judgments in the real world and VR. They reported a critical ratio of 1.08 in real world and 1.16 in VR. However, it is important to note here that this study was done about 10 years ago, and also the HMD used at that point was of lower fidelity and lower field of view. Therefore, it is important to understand how newer HMD devices and graphics capabilities affect how affordance judgments like passability change in VR as compared to the real world. Now, as VR becomes more accessible and varying levels of avatars are used, it is important to understand how the presence of these avatars affects affordance judgments and perception in VR. Looking at research on self-avatars, in 2013, Baraku et al. Studied how embodying a child avatar versus an adult avatar of the same height affected perception of size of objects. Interestingly, they reported that participants who embodied a child avatar overestimated the size of objects rather than the adult, even though they're the same height. In another study by Priyankova et al. In 2014, participants embodied an overweight or an underweight avatar, and the authors reported that the participants' judgments of estimations and affordances were actually affected by the avatar they embodied. Previous research has also looked at the presence of self-avatars in VR and their effect on affordance judgments. In a study by Lin et al. In 2012, authors investigated how having an avatar changes the perception of ducking over or stepping over a horizontal pole. They noted that changing the height of the avatar actually increased the threshold at which the participants changed their judgments from stepping over to ducking under. In another study in 2013 by the same authors, participants were asked to step off of a ledge in the presence or absence of an avatar. The authors reported that having an avatar made participants make more realistic judgments as compared to the real world. However, research on having body-scaled avatars in terms of shoulder width on passability judgments or affordances has been scarce. Passability is one of the most common affordances that we encounter in our daily lives and in VR. We pass through doors, hallways, people, cars, etc., in the real world. And in VR, you can use passability judgments when trying to get through doorways, obstacles, trying to jump over things, trying to avoid things in VR. It could be a host number of things. So in our study, we wanted to look at how the judgment of passability affordance changes when you actually have an avatar of the same size as your own body, and if that actually differs from the real world. So participants simply judge the passability of an adjustable doorway in the real world, and another set of participants did the same in VR with and without an avatar that was the same size as their own body. So there were two research questions that we wanted to explore. One, how do passability judgments from fixed distances differ between real-world and virtual reality simulations? And two, how does the presence of a body-scale self-avatar affect passability judgments from fixed viewing distances? So for our study design, we basically had three between subjects conditions: the real world, VR without self-avatar, and VR with self-avatar. And we used 13 different door widths that were displayed 5 times each for a total of 65 trials per participant. The door widths ranged from 0.7 to 1.3 times the shoulder width of the participant with 0.05 times increments. We had a total of 52 participants, 16 in the real world, 18 in VR no avatar, and 18 in VR avatar. For our device setup, we used an HTC Vive head-mounted display with 110-degree field of view, and to generate the avatar, as I'll explain in the future slides, we basically used 5 HTC Vive trackers, the headset itself, and 2 HTC Vive controllers. And we used a PC with Intel i7 processor, NVIDIA GTX 1080, and 32 gigs of RAM. And we use Unity and Blender to create the environment and set up the simulation. So for experimental apparatus, we conducted the experiments in a room that was 7.5 meters long and 4.5 meters wide. We had a sliding doorway apparatus at one end, which basically had a 0.9 meter opening and a sliding door that we could use to adjust that opening. We also had a starting line and a judgment line. The judgment line was 2 meters away from the door, and the starting line was 2 meters away from the judgment line, further away from the door. For the VR environment, we basically created a replica of this room in Blender and basically overlapped this room onto the real room with the help of tactile feedback and visual angles subtended between the VR and the real world. To map the virtual room onto the real room, we basically positioned the virtual environment onto the real environment, and then we used the HTC Vive controllers to try and tap on different parts of the door and the room and see if that tap actually matched the real world tap. So for example, we would try and tap one edge of the door in VR and see if the controller actually hit that particular edge at that particular point in the real world. If there was a mismatch, we basically calculated an offset between the two and added that offset onto the virtual world, so we would shift things so that everything would overlap. So for the second step, which is visual angle subtended, we basically set the door to a particular opening in the real world and then did the same in VR. And we stood at the judgment line or the starting line and we looked at the door in the real world. Then we put on the headset and we tried to figure out visually if the virtual door opening overlapped with the real door opening. All doorways were verified this way. Here is a picture of the real world environment and the virtual world replica. Both the openings in the pictures of the real world and the VR environment represent the exact same door width, and as you can see, they are very similar to each other. Moving forward to the avatar generation system, for the avatar virtual reality condition, we basically placed two trackers on participants' feet, two trackers behind the elbow, which is what you see in the picture on the left, and one tracker on the lower back. The generated avatar matched the participant's gender, eye height, arm length, and shoulder width. Going into more detail about the generation of the avatar, we had participants stand in the center of the room, and using the HTC Vive controller, we recorded 5 points on their body. One was where their eye height was, two, left shoulder, three, right shoulder, four, right elbow, and five, right wrist. Once these points were recorded, we basically used them to calculate the shoulder width of the participant and the arm length of the participant. Once this process was complete, we simply had participants wear their trackers and stand in a T-pose. Once the participant was standing in a T-pose, we would generate the avatar, apply all the measurements of the shoulder width, eye height, and arm length to the avatar, and then simply map all the different joints of the avatar itself to the different tracker positions using the Final IK plugin. Once the calibration process was complete, we would let participants move around and explore their avatar, and we also asked them to touch their own shoulders with the controllers itself to make sure that the shoulder width of the participant was actually the same as the shoulder width of the avatar. And I'll show you a video of the whole process in just a second. So this is a flowchart of the procedure that we followed for each of the participants. So if the participant was in the real world, they would simply stand at the starting line, close their eyes, and then the experimenter would change the doorway to a particular doorway by physically moving the door. And then the experimenter would ask the participant to open their eyes, walk 2 meters to the judgment line, and simply make a judgment about if they think they could pass through the opening in front of them without rotating their shoulders. They would simply say yes or no and then simply walk back to the starting line and close their eyes. And then the experimenter would simply slide the door to a different opening based on the random number generation. In the VR condition, if the participant had an avatar, they would go through the whole calibration and ownership process I described earlier, and then go through a cube acclimation phase. The cube acclimation phase is simply something that we added just to make sure that participants who were trying out VR for the very first time understand that all the cues available in the real world, like occlusion, parallax, etc., are actually also available in Salient in VR. In this phase, we basically generated a random cube with a number on one of its faces somewhere in the room, and we would simply ask the participant to walk up to the cube, look for that number, and then read that number to the participant. Then they would basically follow the exact same procedure as in the real world, except for closing their eyes. A shutter would basically drop down in front of their eyes so they wouldn't see the door moving back and forth. Here is a screenshot of the cube acclimation phase. So we would show the participant a cube like that with a number on one of its faces. and the participant would simply walk up to the cube, read that number to the experimenter, and then walk back to the starting line. Here is a video of the real world condition and the VR no avatar condition. So in the real world condition, the experimenter would slide the door to a particular door width while the participant's eyes were closed. Then the participant would simply open their eyes, walk to the judgment line, and then make a judgment about if they could pass through the door or not. In the VR condition, the participant actually had a small circle right underneath them to make sure they understand where they are in the environment, and the small triangle at the head of the circle basically pointed in the direction they were looking in. So in the VR environment as well, they would start behind the starting line, and then instead of closing their eyes, their view would be blocked by a GUI screen like that while the door width was adjusted, and then they would basically do the exact same thing as the real world, where they would walk to the judgment line, make a judgment, and then walk back. Here is the video for the VR condition with an avatar. So as you can see at the bottom right, the participant stands in a T pose, and an avatar is generated based on the measurements taken earlier. And then the participant is allowed to move around, check out their avatar, touch their shoulders to make sure it's the same size. Then once they're ready, they move back to the starting line and then wait for the door width to show up. Once the door width shows up, they walk to the judgment line, make a judgment about if they could pass through the door or not, and then simply walk back. The independent variable in our study was the conditions, so the real world condition, the VR no avatar, and the VR avatar condition, and the dependent variable was just a judgment variable, which is what was recorded when the participants made a judgment about a particular door width. And the judgments which were yes or no were coded as 1 for yes and 0 for no. We explored two hypotheses. One, when the aperture width is close to the participant's shoulder width, passability judgments will be different in the virtual world as compared to the real world. And two, for VR experiences, possibility judgments will be significantly better in the VR conditions as compared to the no avatar conditions. This is based on previous research where we saw that judgments actually improved and were affected by the presence of an avatar and the size of the avatar itself. So for our results, we used the hierarchical linear modeling analysis technique. And as I mentioned before, the judgments were coded as 1 or 0. We also calculated a passability ratio, which was the door width divided by the shoulder width of the participant. So a ratio of 1 meant that the shoulder width of the participant and the door width were the exact same size. A ratio less than 1 means that the door width was smaller, and then the ratio greater than 1 means that the door width was larger. With respect to the demographics, there was no difference between the gender distribution across conditions or the shoulder width. The embodiment scores for only the avatar condition, since that was the only condition there was an avatar, was 1.81 on a scale from 0.3 to 3, which is a medium high score. Talking about the judgment variable, we see that as the door width increased, participants were more likely to judge the doors to be passable in all three conditions, which is great because that tells us that the system that we built and the effort we put into overlap the system actually work, and the judgments are actually being scaled as the door width increased in all three conditions. When the ratio was close to 1, participants in the real world condition were more likely to judge door width as passable compared to the VR no avatar and VR avatar condition, which means that there's actually a difference between the real world condition and the VR condition. So this supports our first hypothesis, which says that the judgments will differ between the real world and the VR condition. However, looking at the no avatar and avatar conditions in VR, there was actually no significant difference between conditions, which contradicts what previous research has said when it comes to avatars and affordances. One reason for this effect could be that the avatars we used only tracked 8 points on the body, so it could not mimic complex shoulder motions like shrugging. Therefore, not being able to replicate those shoulder movements could have affected the participants' possibility judgments through the doorway. Now, looking at the critical ratio, which is the point at which a participant's judgment changes from yes to no or no to yes, for the real world, the critical ratio was actually less than 0.9, which is different from what previous research has suggested. This could be because of various different reasons. One of them is that we actually used percentages of the participant's shoulder width rather than specific measurements like 2 centimeter or 3 centimeter between judgments. Another reason could be that we actually measured participant judgments at a much closer distance as compared to previous research. Also, for our experiment, we actually used a realistic doorway. Previous research also suggests that having objects similar to what we are used to seeing in the real world actually affects our judgments. So just looking at a realistic doorway could have affected judgments in the real world rather than seeing poles, which is what was used in the previous research. When looking at the critical ratio for the VR conditions, we see that the VR avatar no avatar conditions are very close to 1, which is actually closer to what has been previously reported. So in conclusion, we see that users engage in body scaling similarly in VR and in the real world. However, judgments differ in VR as compared to the real world when measured from a fixed viewing distance. Seeing a synchronous virtual body from a first-person perspective does not seem to significantly affect approach passability. And as I mentioned before, one of the limitations of our work is that we could not mimic complex shoulder movements, which could have possibly affected our judgments. Another limitation of our work is that we did not actually test our avatar system against any other systems like mocap or other motion capture suits. With that, I thank you for attending this talk, and a big thanks to all my co-authors listed here. I will be taking questions now.